could take, let's say, the 17th century, the mid-17th century, as the starting point of the modern era. The 1650s in Europe, at least, is considered to be the beginnings of the Enlightenment. And there is a debate among some historians, about whether the Enlightenment is a real turning point in Europe in particular, around violence, and whether it's the Enlightenment and the invention of reason, if I can put it that way, that leads to a diminution of violence. But the interesting thing is that well before the Enlightenment kicks off, homicide rates in Western Europe are pretty much down to modern rates of homicide in Europe today, which is around 1 in 100,000 per population. That's how we measure homicide. So that France and England and pretty much most parts of Germany have already very low homicide rates. And I find that intriguing because we are talking about societies and polities that have not yet highly centralized bureaucracies. They do to an extent in England and in France, but they don't have the institutions that we would normally associate with highly centralized states.
Philip, I quote you, other scholars have been at pains to expand definition of violence to include actions that were once never considered violent. I mean, something like the example that you made right now. But now are, I'm quoting you again, including systems that maintain people in coercive, exploitative relationships, such as slavery and forced labor, human trafficking in people and body parts, the slow and utterly unspectacular growth of poverty that can lead to disease and premature death, and the overexploitation and degradation of the environment. End of quote. Do you think defining or formulating violence is always one step behind where violence is being exercised, in a way that always through the distance that future provides us, or even geographical distance? I am here, I'm not at home, I'm not in Middle East, I can analyze it in Europe. We can look back in history and define something as violent. I mean, we need probably a distance, either geographically or time distance, historic distance, to recognize something in the first place as violent.
And you're right. I mean, this is something that's always existed. And again, since recorded history, we've always known that victorious armies rape and kill. And up until the early Middle Ages, it was quite common for victorious armies to kill all the men, or the fighting men, and to enslave the rest of the population, and to rape the women. And there was nothing that was ever thought wrong about this. In the modern era, it occurred too, and I find it really interesting that we're not talking about this with the war in Ukraine, and I cannot for the life of me imagine that Russian soldiers are not committing acts of rape as we speak, but nobody's talking about it. So, and I find, I'm curious, I don't know why, but I'm be very curious to find out why there's that development. And it's true, we never really talked about it until well after the Second World War.
Like, Philip, when I think of the intersectionality of violence and colonialism, for example, sometimes I think that I can claim, although it is very unreflected, or I haven't done any research on that some forms of violence can be tolerated and some forms of violence can be less tolerated. In a sense, I'm quoting you, for example, the formal abolition of torture did not mean that it vanished altogether. It continued to be used in Europe's colonies throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, but its use was very different. During the wars of decolonization in the second half of 20th century, thousands of freedom fighters were tortured by their imperial overlords in Vietnam and Kenya. For example, I mean, as I said earlier, perhaps it is too hasty for a conclusion like that, or such observation to say that there is a correlation between declining violence in Europe and increasing it, or seeing it on increase in European colonies.
Yeah, and I think that's true for some forms of violence, and certainly those kinds of violence, the kinds of violence used by the military and or the state and its institutions, which were no longer considered to be acceptable in Europe, were and continued to be practiced in the European colonies. So corporal punishment, for example, so whipping people as a punishment, ceased in Europe by the middle of the 19th century, although it was used in, I think in English prisons maybe until the early part of the 20th century and so on. But on the whole, so again, hidden from view, on the whole, it was no longer considered to be acceptable. And it was certainly no longer considered acceptable to whip women in Europe. And yet we continued to do that in the European colonies, and torture, especially in the second half of the 20th century when the wars of decolonization began and the military wanted to suppress these movements by any means they could. Algeria is a really interesting case where the French, who themselves had suffered under a Nazi occupation and whose resistance fighters had been tortured by the Nazis, employed the same methods against Algerian resistance fighters, but